Ron? Mm-hmm. Alrighty, good morning everyone here from the Wyoming Tribune Eagle and myself. I am Joel Funk, our state government reporter, and I am joined this morning by Representative Dan Zwonitzer, a Republican from Cheyenne, who is our longest serving legislator here in Laramie County. Good morning, Dan.
Morning, Joel. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. For many of us here in the Cowboy State, we are on the verge of the big show, the 2018 budget session of the Wyoming Legislature, where lawmakers will be making some historic decisions that will take the state in a certain direction in coming years. Big questions are looming with the $900 million structural deficit for the two-year budget for fiscal years 2019-2020. That's a disputed figure. It goes up, it goes down, we never know. But it's certainly going to lead to some heated discussions and close votes in the next 20 business days. And Dan is going to help make some sense of what we can expect to see, or explain why things won't make sense, perhaps. But in his K-12 education, lawmakers contracted an $800,000 study to examine the state's track with our funding model, and that in fact we probably should be spending more to reach our educational goals.
About $60 million.
About six, yeah.
Than our current funding, yeah.
Right, and you know, you've been in the Capitol for some of these waves and discussions about education funding. What's your take on where we are right now, and what do you think could or should be done to address these questions in 2018?
Okay. So again, thanks for having me this morning. And I've been in since 2005, and since I've been in, you know, we've slowly increased funding for education the entire time, and so trying to cut it back has been really difficult. Just as last year with a $30 million cut, we're looking at a $450 million a year shortage, primarily through the K-12 budget. Trying to figure out how we're going to make that up is not easy, and right now, the Revenue Committee came back. We have no real revenue bills on the table from an interim study, from an interim committee to be introduced to the legislature. And so we're back to where we were about a year ago with not a lot more options than we had a year ago at this point, except we have to make decisions by June 30th, because as of July 1st, 2018, we're somewhere around $400 million in the hole. And we're doing all sorts of stuff to structure that down, but we're still legitimately looking at $200 million right now. In deficit spending, that unless we find a way to either cut spending or increase revenue, we'll be burning that out of the rainy day fund, or what we call the LSRA, the Legislative Stabilization Reserve Account, but commonly referred to as a rainy day fund. So it's really just, if we can't find a way to raise revenue or cut spending, we'll be burning through our savings, and we can do that for maybe a couple more bienniums, but unless we find a way to solve this problem of our structural deficit here in about a decade, we're going to have the same problem and no savings account, and then have to take something drastic in the states. So it would be my desire and my hope is we find some ways to slowly encourage revenue this year, because the longer we wait, the worse it's going to get. And nobody likes tax increases, but one of these days here come down the future, it's going to be a pretty significant tax increase unless we can take some incremental steps now. Mm-hmm.
And I want to take a chance to re-welcome everyone. We're interviewing Representative Dan Zwonitzer, a Cheyenne Republican, about the 2018 budget session, and we would love to hear from our viewers. Please submit questions. We're happy to take them. And but fair to say, Dan, that the two options that are on the table, generating revenue through the big T that no one wants to hear, taxes, or reducing funding levels for services and education, are going to have real-world consequences for people in Wyoming.
It's true, and there's no easy solution right now. We're looking at a lot of things for the future. I mean, Endow has been making recommendations. We can talk about that here in a bit. But for the immediate shortfall, we do not have some grand plan behind the scenes going in the session, at least not that anyone's told me. And when I've asked people, there isn't something waiting in the wings that we're going to be bringing out here next week that's going to solve all of our problems. I think there was some belief the Revenue Committee, they spent 5 meetings, formal meetings, a lot other work behind the scenes to try to say, hey, what levels of increases, what revenue enhancers or fee bills. So I hate to use the word tax as well, because there are some taxes and then there are some, fees for services. And I think right now we're looking about, if we have to raise some fees, how do we do that on out-of-state people, not our residents? And so we're looking at that, I think, in the lodging tax increase you saw basically come out of left field last week after the Revenue Committee decided there were no committee bills they were going to bring forward.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Dan, because it's been a matter of some discussion that the Revenue Committee is obviously tasked with one of the hardest jobs in the legislature. The Management Council wanted them to develop sets of plans to generate different levels of revenue in coming years. And they did identify some streams through savings diversions, but ultimately all the significant tax bills were defeated. And so the question is, did they do, or did they accomplish the goal that they set out to? Were they undermined on some level by leadership that didn't seem to be on board with what they wanted to do? And, you know, what does the scenario look like? Obviously, we're not going to see big tax hikes in 2018, but is there a future in those ideas?
So we are a Republican-dominated state, right? And no Republican certainly ever wants to say we're going to increase taxes or we have to increase taxes. The Revenue Committee legitimately had a very difficult job going forward of just identifying where we could increase taxes and then thoroughly vetting those. As you can imagine, every meeting and every possible tax increase that was on the table, we had a packed house of people coming in saying, not this tax, find it somewhere else.
Right.
And so the Revenue Committee, I think, did a very diligent job. I mean, they took it seriously. They listened to public comment, and the overwhelming public comment was no tax increases anywhere. You've got to be able to cut spending somewhere. Internally, we're scraping the bottom of the barrel at this point. I mean, you'll remember we had a 5% cut across state government back in 2009 under Friedenthal, and we've been doing the penny plan of branching down agencies by 1%. We cut $17 million out of UW. I mean, the legislature has been pretty diligent the last 3 years trying to cut spending everywhere we think it's possible. And I think we've realized internally, and the governor's office has realized, that we cut so deep last year in places like the Department of Health, Department of Family Services, corrections, that adage of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We're taking out that ounce of prevention in the last 2 years, and it's actually going to probably increase our budgets in coming years based on recidivism rates, based on people seeking social services. Yeah. And so the governor's office has recommended we put some money back in those agencies. Yeah. We have to in some cases for the Department of Health, but to restore some funding for community programs, for family services, to make sure we don't actually impact future needs at a greater level than what we're cutting down now. And that's really the fear we're facing at this point.
I want to
go ahead and reintroduce, and then I have a question for you.
I want to re-welcome everyone. We are here with Representative Daniel Zwonitzer, a Cheyenne Republican, and we're talking about the 2018 budget session, which begins Monday with the State of the State address, the final State of the State by Governor Matt Mead, and we are welcoming your questions. We'd love to hear from you. And Josh is indicating that we have a question.
Sure, we have a question from Mary. She wants to know about possibly legalizing cannabis and marijuana as another tax revenue or another stream. What's your personal position on that, and do you think that could be helpful for the state?
Yeah. I think my personal position is we probably could find a way to regulate marijuana and tax it appropriately like Colorado's done. Since I've been in the legislature, I remember back in 05 through 08, we were trying to increase the penalties, make sure we didn't have medical marijuana in this state or prescriptions, and we did a lot of some legislation to prevent even medical. In the last 4 years, especially since Colorado has allowed it, we've seen, I think, an increasing amount of legislators each year that are more and more okay with medical marijuana, with recreational marijuana in Wyoming. I don't think we're there yet as a legislature as a whole. You got to get 31 out of 60 in the House, 16 out of 30 in the Senate. Especially, I think, those of us who are on the Colorado border, we realize a lot of people, I work at LCCC, worked at UW. We know the numbers of people going down there. Whether the legislature as a whole would pass that, I don't think it's realistic this year, even if I think this part of the state would like to either ease penalties or find a way to tax it like we do alcohol or have some type of regulatory structure. I just don't think we're there as a whole yet.
You have a follow-up on that, Joel? You have anything you want to talk about?
I do, Josh. I wasn't going to bring up cannabis, but if it's a topic of interest, surely something that's on people's minds is that I believe we're in the third or fourth consecutive session of trying to codify what the penalty is for different forms of cannabis, especially when it comes to liquid and edible infused products. Mm-hmm. And there's some concern with the bills that are going through right now that you're going to potentially make felons out of people who are committing pretty casual infractions of the legal code in bringing back, say, a package of cupcakes or a bottle of liquid that's infused with cannabis. And some have said that maybe the people that want to codify these things don't understand exactly what these products are, and again, that you're going to be putting harsh penalties on people for relatively minor crimes. What's your take on this marijuana?
Well, and I would say we see it differently somewhat in this county than the rest of the state on that they're casual, small level crimes. Right. I mean, we still have a significant number of legislators who say the law is the law, and we're not going to decrease the penalties on marijuana. Right. I know Representative Byrd has tried 4 or 5 years now to just either decriminalize or decrease the penalties, and that hasn't gone anywhere. With edibles, it's tough. Right now, I've looked, we have 5 different bills that deal with marijuana out there between the House and the Senate, and you can't get the interim committee to agree exactly how to, quantify or qualify the amount of THC in an edible and what that does in the bloodstream and how you test it. Yeah. And it's a real significant concern that it's the data isn't quite there, the testing process on how to justify what that level is in a court of law to punish someone. And people we have legislators who think it should be completely decriminalized and recreational use across the state, to people who say no medical marijuana and are against just, the THC for medications for people's seizures. So when you have 90 people across the gamut, getting a majority of us to agree on marijuana right now is unlikely this next session.
Right.
But we do have 4 more bills to try to continue to build the conversation, but I guess me personally, I don't believe any one of them will get through the whole process on either deregulating or being able to quantify the amount of THC in an edible.
Do you think that the legislature is at an impasse with the issue, that it's too difficult to come to an agreement?
I hate to say we're in an impasse, because we really have been diligently trying. I mean, There is, I think, been strong buy-in and legitimate discussion to the table of how do we solve this. But again, Wyoming's a large state, and there's different feelings across the gamut. So we're going to give it another attempt. We know it's a major issue in the state, especially with Colorado, Montana, and the federal government and what they're going through with this administration, which is kind of pushing back on Colorado. So we have legislators saying, "Hey, let's not jump into this, morass until we figure out what the feds are doing."
I want to re-welcome everyone. We're sitting here with Representative Daniel Zwonitzer, a Cheyenne Republican, and we are talking about the upcoming 2018 budget session, which starts on Monday. And do we have a question, Josh?
Yeah, another question too. This one is about Representative Mike Madden. It says he has introduced another bill for a transfer tax on real property. The commenter says that this is a blatant effort to only tax counties the size and sale volume of Laramie County, Teton County, Natrona County. Mm-hmm. What's your thoughts on his bill, or what's your thoughts on that in general?
Yeah. And so, Mike Madden, brilliant guy, PhD in economics. He's a chairman of our revenue committee. He understands the structural deficit better than most legislators, and says, you got to do something. And so he has fallen on his sword multiple times now to bring forth some good bills that say, here's a way that we could solve our problem. They're not popular. I mean, and he knows it, and the legislature knows it, but God bless him, he's trying to find a way, that someone's putting something forward. That being said, on this specific tax, I'm against it. The majority, I think, of the legislature is also against it, because it does disproportionately hurt Laramie County and the services we provide. Because but almost any tax increase in the state would, impact Laramie County, Teton County at higher levels. And so, other states have a service tax. It's not, this new territory that we're taxing something that's never been taxed before. It's just, once again, not a popular tax for those people who have to pay it, right? Realtors, lawyers. And that's a pretty powerful lobby. And the 2 largest PACs in this state at the state level are the Wyoming Education Association and Wyoming Realtors. So, I don't believe that one's going to go anywhere, but it's a discussion we need to have. I mean, now that the Revenue Committee has not brought forth a single revenue-enhancing bill, it's up to individual legislators to try to say, hey, here's some options, let's keep discussing them. We're going to have to find a solution sometime. Because I don't honestly think anybody believes we can cut spending to the level of the budget crisis we're currently at. I mean, we looked at the education budget for K-12 in this state. With this deficit, it's basically 24% of the entire education budget is what we're facing. If you put it in real terms, if we don't solve this, that's 1 out of every 4 teachers in Wyoming. And we don't have a great plan yet to how to solve it. We tried last year and we all agreed, let's spend all year in 2018 or 2017 to come to the 2018 session on what can we do. We're going to recalibrate and see if we can save money. Comes back 16 million more than we're spending. We're going to find all these revenue things to see if there's something we can agree upon as a legislature. Every one of them failed. And so we're really back to where we were a year ago with 4 months to go to figure out how to solve it. And I think my personal fear is if we can't figure out how to solve it, we just spend more money out of our savings account right now, which we can do, sure, but we can't do much longer.
Let me jump in on this too real quick. Deb has just asked, along those same lines, what's your view on the lodging tax and where you're on that one particularly?
I think it's okay. You know, it's one of those things that I hate the lodging tax when I go to another state, right? I'm like 14.5% when I go to DC, and we have to pay that. Do I think it's more palatable for the legislature? Certainly, right? Because that tax is on out-of-state residents. I mean, the one major tax we've done in this state in the last 12 years was a fuel tax. I still get emails about that, how horrible we were to raise it 10 cents. But the revenue and the data show that 52% of that is paid by out-of-state people traveling through Wyoming. And I think that's what made that tax palatable. So if there is one tax increase, I think we can maybe get through the legislature this year. It probably is a lodging tax. And it is significant, if I can add, that it's from Senator Bebout, the president of the Senate, who spent all year traveling around the state saying, don't tax this, don't tax that. For him to come out with a tax option is a pretty big deal, and I think people will listen. So that does have a chance.
Do you think that the tourism lobby has come out and said that they're open to that idea, they're open to discussing it, because their leisure and hospitality tax proposal was defeated by a tie vote in the Revenue Committee. It's not coming this year, and so Bebout's come at the last minute with this lodging tax, but the tourism lobby has said, we're open to it, but give us the interim to work on it. Do you think that that's reasonable? Do you think that it stands a chance in spite of that?
You know, anytime you put a new tax out there, it's a hit, and especially, you know, a lodging tax, it hits one segment of our industry, tourism, our number 2 industry in the state, you know, out of nowhere, really. This came out last week. If this passes, it'll probably go into effect in July. People have made hotel reservations, travel, you know, a year in advance, and all of a sudden they thought they knew what they were getting. They're going to get a lodging tax of, you know, 5 to 10%, depending what we agree upon as a number. And it does put a hit, especially on small businesses. I mean, certainly we have large hotel chains, but a lot of our retailers who own small level hotels throughout rural Wyoming, this is going to hit them kind of hard. And it's, you know, it's something that we discussed in the interim, the Revenue Committee, more on a leisure and hospitality. Yeah. This one is aimed specifically at lodging, which I actually think the industry is not happy about. Certainly, I mean, they want input, just like anybody would want input when you're going to be taxed. So they're going to probably put up a fight, and we'll see if we can amend it to something that's palatable, or at least we can live with. Because we got to find a revenue option. Nobody wants to hear it, but we got to find a revenue option in the state in the very near future.
We want to re-welcome everyone to the Wyoming Tribune Eagles Facebook Live broadcast with Representative Dan Zwonitzer, a Cheyenne Republican, and we're talking about the 2018 budget session, which begins on Monday. Mm-hmm. And I'd invite you to submit your questions. We're more than happy to answer them. Do we have any right now? We're going to keep on steamrolling then. I don't know this is my first time, Dan. I'm trying.
Okay, steamrolling.
Obviously, one of the biggest stories of 2017 and going to the beginning of 2018 here is Governor Matt Mead's Endow initiative, standing for economically needed diversity options for Wyoming. Mm-hmm. 70% of the state's revenue roughly comes from mining, and obviously anyone with a history in Wyoming knows that our economy booms and busts with that industry. Right now, we're recovering from a bust. And, you know, even though there's been some optimism in mining of late, especially in oil, economic forecasters and a report from the U.S. Department of Energy this month have indicated that we're never going to see the levels that we saw with coal. We're probably topped out there, and they don't expect a boom in oil and gas that's going to bring us back. And so that "Lord, please give me one more bus" prayer is probably not going to be answered unless something significant changes. So the idea is that we need to attract a diverse array of industries that can broaden our economic base, but we face this dilemma that we're talking about cutting services, reducing spending in education, but we want to attract people to Wyoming. So what's your take on that dilemma first? Because that one is a doozy, I would say.
On mining, right? And so we call it extractive industries because coal, oil, gas, bentonite, trona. I mean, that's our number one by far that we rely on the state, and it's gotten us through for 100 years, really. And we've gone through the boom and bust cycle, and the projections show it's going to be a slow, gradual decline. So it's another one of those things that we need to have a plan in the next 5 or 10 years. I think we saw everything bottom out. They've gone back, and all the projections have a nice, slow, steady decline. That being said, for the first time, wind and solar are completely economically feasible. I think you're going to see a huge boom. Even the coal industry will kind of tell you, and the oil industry lobbyists will say solar and wind are actually economically viable for the first time in a long time. I've gone through a lot of these meetings. We thought coal would have this kind of decline over the next 50 years, and wind and solar would have a slow uptick. With advances in technology, wind and solar, they're the future, and not in 2 more generations, really this generation. So that being said, if our historical reliance on taxing industry, the question really is, Wyoming is right for wind and we're right for solar. They're both finite resources, and Wyoming has some of the best wind, anything on the continental United States. And so we have a tax proposal out there to increase the wind tax. And I think that's something we need to legitimately look at, right? Wyomingites would certainly rather increase taxes on an industry than they would on their own income. So that deserves a look, and that may be the future. We've been taxing coal for 100 years. We'll start taxing wind and solar because we really are prime in the state for those 2 industries. That being said, you don't want to tax them too high as they are starting up in Wyoming, but it's probably not fair to let them start up and get going and then tax them after they're here, because that's why people hate government, including in me. So you want to be honest and upfront that maybe we're going to have a wind tax at a higher level than the 1% we have now in the next 10 years. Long-term economic Endow initiative. I think they spent the year. They came back with some good recommendations. I wouldn't say anything with earth-changing, an entire new direction, but it's their first year. This is a 20-year effort, but they really did focus on what's going to keep Wyoming viable economically, and their number one priority is air service.
Right.
And I don't know if we always see that in Cheyenne because we are so close to DIA, but if you want industry throughout Wyoming, especially in these middle-sized towns of 5,000 to 10,000 people, they need an airport, and they need some help in subsidizing those. So they get some federal subsidies. If Wyoming could kick some money in, they have community matches. We have this initiative in Endow this year, which is kind of it's actually this new model that YDOT's trying, and I think we're all going to support, that we'll do a 10-year contract with the airline industry and say, hey, if we'll get some price breaks and we'll get 10 years of air service. It's going to be a lot of money up front, $15 million. But if it keeps air service in Wyoming for the next 10 years, that's what's going to keep those middle-sized towns economically viable. We just got a great new manufacturing enterprise coming into Sheridan called Weatherby. Part of that is they need to have air service. Sheridan is a great town, but it needs to be served by an airport because it's 3 hours, 2.5 hours to Billings, 2.5 hours to Rapid City. We got to make sure that Sheridan has air service to get people there. So the Endow initiatives, I think, are strong. I think the legislature knows that not only do we have a significant problem right now, but we are going to have a significant problem on what we're doing long-term in the state that we need to start working towards. And so the governor's vision of Endow and the council, while I don't always agree with all of it, I think they are doing what they need to be doing, and I think their initiatives deserve being put forward and pushing through. So
I was just going to say we have about 15 more minutes, so maybe quick hits on this one.
Okay. I'll welcome everyone one more time to our live Facebook broadcast of my conversation with Representative Dan Zwonitzer, a Cheyenne Republican. I'm Joel Funk, the state government reporter, and we are talking about the 2018 budget session, which begins on Monday with the State of the State address by Governor Matt Mead, his final as governor in his second term. Mm-hmm. And it's a little unrelated to the legislative session, but I know it's on folks' minds. We're starting to see some more people enter the governor's race, and certainly some different visions for where to take Wyoming. And obviously, the governor makes his recommendations. He has veto power, but the legislature is, it's its own entity. But can you explain to folks, in your experience, how has the person occupying that office driven policy and where the legislature goes in Wyoming?
That's a pretty broad question. And we do have, it is interesting. 8 years ago, when we knew the governor's office would be open, people had announced by November, December, had put themselves out there. I think a lot of the political observers are saying it is a little weird right now that, a couple of the big names we were thinking or hoping to jump in haven't done so yet. But that being said, I think the governor's office, in most people's minds, since I've worked there and I've worked for 2 governors now, there's a lot of internal stuff that the governor does that is really unrelated to kind of what they say on the campaign trail about, we need to fight the feds and we need to keep taxes low. I mean, the governor, they're appointing state agency directors who run the gamut of social services in the state. They're in charge of finding the right people to be judges throughout Wyoming, the district and circuit court levels, and even the state Supreme Court. So the governor's office has a lot of stuff internal that I don't think, people realize when they're out on the campaign trail, when the governor says, hey, we have to make sure, we keep Wyoming economically viable and we stop federal intrusion and the things that we've heard, for 50 years in gubernatorial races. Wyoming's political outlook really hasn't changed. We don't like federal interference. We don't like taxes. We don't like, having 52% of our state controlled by the federal government without a lot of say that what we as a legislature get to push back on. And so the governor's race, I guess I find that the people who have an experience with state government tend to do better because the learning curve isn't quite as sharp. Yeah. It's one thing to kind of do the campaign tactics and give a good speech, but I guess I'm looking for in the governor somebody who's been around the block, who kind of knows the internal workings of the state. We're a little fragile right now, and everything's going pretty well, but whoever the next governor is going to have some tough times in front of them on, if we cut services or we raise revenue. The governor is the chief budget official of the state, and the budget starts with them. They put forth their budget, appropriations will work on it and figure out the legislative priorities, but we really start from the governor's mindset. And so I think it's important to have a governor who has a pretty good understanding of the community college system, the university, corrections, and that takes a long time to build up that knowledge. So I'm hoping somebody a little more internal steps forward. I like some of the current candidates out there now, but it's easy to campaign like anything in the legislature. We do it all the time. We campaign on 5 or 6 issues, but you find we have 600 different issues that most people don't pay attention to that we have to solve. Right. I run the committee on utilities and insurance and some of the more boring things that don't make the press. But I'll tell you that I'll tell you some of the most important things in the state are what the energy usage and energy rates are and what we charge consumers. Yeah. I mean, if you can get cheaper energy rates, we're more likely to get businesses, industry, more people not paying bills. That money goes, into the economy. So there's a lot of other stuff the government does, the legislature and the governor, than what we campaign on, I guess, is the takeaway.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, everyone, for submitting questions and for watching this event. Quickly, Dan, as time runs out here, I want to ask, jumping back to Endow, a lot of the theme of this year for the legislation is overcoming barriers to economic diversification, like you mentioned, air service, the other top priority being broadband, developing a workforce. Do you think that that's a hard case to make to people, that you're not really doing things that are turning around results in terms of dollars immediately, that overcoming barriers is a little bit more of a stretch to make with people, to say that we're doing this, we're making this investment because in the long term we're setting ourselves up for the potential that we can reach by doing these things?
Sure. I mean, everybody wants the quick turnaround. They want the budget to come back, their property values to go up, to get that better job, to have to pay less taxes, those type of things. But really, as a government, it takes a long time of effort to grow an economy.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes in Cheyenne we don't see that because we are so government-based, between the federal influence, the state, county, schools here. Our economy really does run on the government more than most everywhere else in Wyoming. You go out into Converse County, which is dependent on industry. They lost half their assessed valuation in a year and a half ago. That was a huge hit. Their sales and tax revenues went down 45% in 6 months. Taking that kind of hit out there is extreme, and I think we are a little insulated from that in Cheyenne. I mean, that we realize, we talk about that we know that our economy is based on extractive industries, but we don't have coal trains going by our house. We don't have our friends and neighbors out in the oil rigs to the same level that a lot of places in Wyoming do. And so you don't realize, I think, in this county, the mindset of people outside of Cheyenne and Laramie, that our economy is based on the Front Range, really, and that growth and that quality of life. The economy of a lot of Wyoming is based on the mineral industry, and it's been pretty volatile the last 2 years. And there's a lot of, I hate to call it jealousy, but that's somewhat what it is, that we've been insulated in Laramie County from a lot of the problems that have been happening throughout Wyoming with the energy downturn. We don't see it maybe as much. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of legislators come to Cheyenne and say, hey, state government employees, you're making too much. You don't realize how tough it is out there. We need to cut government. Because right now the rest of Wyoming is pretty hard hit economically, and they don't want tax increases. Yeah. And I totally agree. And they do have that belief that we should be able to cut government more.
Okay. To that end, Emily just asked, former county commissioner, Emily just asked what parts of the government can be cut right now in your mind.
And it's tough. I mean, you want to say...
I thought this would be an easy
We've
one.
known this. Really, we've known we have a structural deficit since 2013 that K-12 was not going to be what it was in the golden age of Wyoming from coal bed methane from 2003 to 2009. And we've taken, we did a 5% across the board. We've done strategic cuts the last 4 years. We've done the penny plan on top of the strategic cuts to cut 1%, out of everyone's budget. I think at this point, if there was an easy place to cut funding, we would be doing it. We're at the point where you're basically cutting salaries, cutting the number of state employees. And I won't tell you that, we could cut another 20 or 30 state employees, and you're hoping we do that through attrition, not through, job loss. And we're gonna have to cut education. Nobody wants to hear it. There's just no way around it. And so even the Cheyenne community, it's gonna be noticeable next year. If we don't raise taxes, and I don't think we're gonna raise them to the level we need to, you're gonna see another huge cut in education, and I'm hoping no teachers lose their jobs, but I think if you want a teaching job in Wyoming, this is not the year to be applying. We're hoping we can get it through by attrition, but the K-12 budget is just so far underwater, we have no choice but to cut into education in some way, shape, or form. But there's really no magic pot of money out there. Right now, we're saving nothing. I know. For 10 years, we were putting money in bank accounts and we were saving, for this moment, knowing it would come. And there's no savings left. I mean, we are spending down $200 to $300 million this biennium from our savings. We are diverting all of our revenue streams to keep K-12 somewhat above water. We've cut it. And I know there are a lot of people out there that said you can always cut more somewhere. And you're going to see that cut through education. I don't think we have any choice but to see that cut through education. So either through the university, community colleges, or K-12, because that's really about 80% of our funding shortfall is in education. You can't cut prison guards. You can't cut, the basic state employees you need for the social safety net. We're already cutting programs, and I think that's going to come back to haunt us, as the governor's been saying. We're putting a little more money there just because we know it's going to hurt us more in the long run. So I don't have a great idea of where we cut anymore. That's why I think I brought a bill on revenue for when AML dollars go away here in 3 years. That's a historic stream of money we're paying now. It's $60 million that is going to go away unless we try to find a way to recapture it. And I thought that might be the easiest, most friendly way to continue a current tax that's not really an increase. But that's another $60 million hit we're going to take in 2 years if we don't try to recapture that. So, we can be optimistic and positive for about 8 more years, 4 more bienniums, because we're burning through our savings. But we got to find a plan. And no politician wants to bite the bullet on a tax increase. But unless the feds come up with a couple more coal lease bonuses, and we might get one, we're optimistic. But I don't think you count on the feds bailing us out when they're about $22 trillion in debt, and they're having their own problems. And one of these days, the feds are going to say, we can't support the states what they're supporting us now, and they're going to start decreasing, their match. And then we're really going to be up a creek. So I hate to be the dismal one to come on and say, hey, we have problems. But we have problems. And somebody has to solve them in the next 2 or 4 years, because we can't burn through our entire savings account without somebody offering a solution. And that's my take on it.
I don't have any specific questions, but I was curious if you could talk about some of the social issue bills that are coming through right now. Do you think that's a waste of time, a good thing to get into the budget session? I know it's a short session. So.
Yeah, so we have a budget session where bills should be related to the budget in some way, shape, or form, or somehow such a significant issue that they need to take place this year. We do have, I've seen 6 or 7 different interesting social bills, from making pornography a health crisis.
Let me list them off, and you just instantly tell me what you think.
Sure.
Making pornography a health crisis. What do you think of that bill?
It doesn't have a Senate co-sponsor. It doesn't have a wide variety of legislators on it. I don't expect it to go anywhere.
Okay. Stand your ground.
The Stand Your Ground law, I think actually our laws are pretty solid in Wyoming regarding that. I know some people don't believe so, but we could pass it. I don't think anything would change. We could not pass it. I don't think anything will change. It's a political gun issue, which people really like to get behind, so it may go through the process. But I've read through it. The language basically just copies what we do now, and in my mind, it's a little bit of feel-good legislation, but we could pass it with no extreme consequences.
Joel, would you have any of those off your top of your head?
We have a couple others on.
Those are the 2 that are the big ones.
Yeah, we had one come out yesterday on sanctuary cities.
Sanctuary cities was another big one. Yeah.
Cities and counties better not, be taken, illegal immigrants. I don't know if that's a huge problem. We have had some incidents of finding, illegal in some of our agricultural or mining communities in the state. I don't think it's at all the level of what you've seen in other states, but it's part of the national conversation, and I don't expect that to get through the whole process in a budget session. We have an interesting bill from Chuck Gray and Casper on suing the state of Washington because they won't let our coal through. I think that's a really bad way to go, because we've just spent a couple $1 million in tourism marketing to the Seattle and the Washington state community to come to Wyoming and visit, and now we're going to turn around and sue them, which is not good in my mind, and that's an economic development inhibitor. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, social issues, they're tough, especially I think we've designed the budget year to be the election year because we don't want to deal with social issues. It is an election year coming up. Obviously, there's a lot of interest with a national level of people on all sides, and I think with a revenue shortage and burning into our savings, you're going to see a lot of people on both sides saying the legislature has to do something because we can't burn into our savings, and people will be upset. You're going to see the legislature do something and cut, some numbers of teachers and state employees, and you're going to have those people upset. You're going to have some tax increases, which will get people upset. I think you're going to have a lot of upset people in Wyoming this next election cycle on all ends of the spectrum, and you'll see a pretty vibrant campaign.
In 2016, you saw in Laramie County, partisanship really took a hard turn with some of the seats. And, we have Representative Jim Byrd, a Cheyenne Democrat, who's not going to be running now.
And he's the only Democrat of the 15. So we have 10 members in the House from Laramie County and 5 senators, 14-1. And the one Democrat just announced he's probably not running for the legislature again.
So do you expect to see, either locally or statewide, to see that turn to partisanship continue to shift right?
I think you're going to see a more active election cycle. When Obama got elected, the 2 years after that, we saw one of the most active election cycles in the state. Mm-hmm. And you're going to see, I think, people running in both sides of the Republicans, from the far right to the social conservatives to libertarians. And you'll see more Democrats run. And I think you'll have some more viable races, both between moderate Republicans and Republicans further to the right, plus Democrats. And so as an elected official, knowing that, there's not a lot of money out there, we're going to be cutting, people are going to be angry, I'm going to have a tough competitor in a primary and a general, it's going to be a rough year in electoral politics in Wyoming. That's possibly why no one's, chomping at the bit to jump into the governor's race or some of the other statewide races, because everybody knows it's not going to be much fun in Wyoming politics the next couple of years. We're going to have to make some cuts and make some hard choices, and it's going to be difficult. So we'll see how many legislators come back, either if they want to come back or they can get reelected.
Right.
We saw 20 new members of the House, the largest turnover we've had since we did districts in '92. This freshman class is the largest we've had in 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see if next freshman class, if they all want to stay or we have a complete turnover again.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes a difference when you get 1/3 of the House turnover and the budget is new to them, and they make some campaign promises and they try to deliver. It's difficult.
Yeah.
I'm going to just reintroduce, and I think we're 5 or 10 more minutes here, so maybe.
Okay. I want to re-welcome everyone to the Wyoming Tribune Eagles Facebook Live conversation with Representative Dan Zwonitzer, a Cheyenne Republican, and we are discussing the 2018 budget session, which begins on Monday with the State of the State address by Governor Matt Mead, the final of his second term. Looking at 2018's election cycle, you were you're one of the co-chairs of elections and the elections committee. And I'm wondering, do you think that the bills that you've proposed, can you give a brief summation of them and then, or that your committee sponsored, and can you give a brief summation and then explain kind of what you think those chances are and why they're important?
Yeah, so we have 3 committee bills in the Corporations and Elections Committee that I chair, and they're all designed really as a response to what we saw in the 2016 election. People remember that we had a pretty robust election cycle. There were a lot of allegations that the Democrats were putting dark money ads and the Republicans were putting dark money ads against the Democrats, and we saw a lot of flyers, specifically in I think 16 races. You couldn't really account for where the money was coming from in some of these cases and who was behind it. So we really took a holistic effort of all of campaign laws. We have 3 different bills. One is in regards to complaints. So if you have a complaint, the really question is, where does it go?
Right.
Went to the Secretary of State. Right now it does. Secretary of State says, well, that looks legitimate. We'll turn it over to the Attorney General. The Attorney General can make a call, or they can send it back to district court, which is what we had this year. There's a complaint at Laramie. Went from the county attorney to the Secretary of State to the Attorney General back to the county attorney, and nobody really felt that the law gave them the right to make a decision to punish or penalize a certain group that may or may not have been acting out of the bounds, because the bounds weren't very clear.
That was difficult to explain concisely in a news story.
It is. And so, we have some laws against what you can do in a campaign and with campaign finance, but we don't right now have a legitimate way to say, hey, you have violated the law and you need to be held accountable. And so one of our bills really just sets up this process of at what point is someone responsible for making a decision, and at what level can you fine an organization or a person or a PAC or a campaign treasurer versus a campaign chairman, and what you can prove they knew or if they acted inappropriately, and how you can go after some of these funding sources that are difficult to track. So some of it's more transparency in politics and campaign finance. Some of it is really having the government have a little more responsibility, either to the county government or the Attorney General, on saying, hey, this is out of bounds, you can't do these type of campaign activities.
Yeah.
That's one. 2 is we have...
That was one.
That was just one bill, yeah. 2 is we have this as an individual on registration offenses. So we have seen some people, arguably, we can't prove, that have jumped districts, and so they own 2 houses, and if the election is more exciting, shall we say, it's a ballot proposition in the city, they're going to vote at that house this year in the primary, and in the general they'll be voting in their other house somewhere else. And we're really trying to crack down on that because we know it is a problem. I don't think we have any illegal voting, but we certainly allow people who have multiple properties to basically claim where they want to vote.
Right.
And so we have some more investigation authority on tracking that down and ensuring people can't continue to precinct jump, really. So that's another one. And then the other one is just we have some I guess, in campaign tactics, Wyoming, historically, we've been really good about not facing, I know Cheyenne people see the Colorado commercials and how they can be pretty brutal. We haven't had that lately, but it's increasing. And so we have some new laws on what they call electioneering communications. So right now you can put an ad that you have to, say you're behind if you support a candidate. You say, I support this. You have to say, here's how much we paid for that ad. If you make an ad right now that says, candidate X really hates guns or wants to raise your taxes, you're not making an explicit endorsement of their candidacy or against it, and so you don't have to file any paperwork on that. And so people have gotten really good about, not expressly saying, vote for this guy, but they've said, this guy hates guns or likes taxes or pick a social issue.
Right.
And we haven't had to have them say how much they've spent on those campaigns. So we're going to fix that. Wyoming election law has been a little weak just because we have not seen what other states have seen the last 15 years. We've been insulated. Mm-hmm. And I think more than ever we're realizing Wyoming is no longer insulated to electoral politics and campaigns.
All right, well, I want to thank everyone again for tuning in and submitting questions. This has really been a fun time with our flagship Facebook Live Talk with the Legislator live cast here. And thank you, Dan, so much for coming and talking with us. And best of luck to you in the upcoming session. It should be...
we'll need it. It's going to be tough, and people are going to be upset. And it's just, we've had it really going strong the last 10 years in Wyoming. We had a lot of money from a lot of revenue, and we're about to face a bust. And yeah, the next couple of years are going to be rough in politics, but we're going to get through them, and we have a bright future ahead in Wyoming.
Great. Well, I want to invite everyone to submit feedback. We'd love to hear from you, and tune in next time when we come back at you with Facebook Live.